Snoop had been gone just a few weeks, handling business, moving quiet, but the second he stepped into his studio, he knew something was off. The walls that used to hum with bass and stories now echoed with forced laughter, ring lights, and the sound of 5 TikTokers arguing about who stole whose brand deal. The mic booth smelled like bubblegum vape, the mixing board was covered in iced coffee cups, and someone had the nerve to hang a neon sign that said "Creator Energy Only." Snoop didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the ring light circle glowing on the wall where his platinum plaque used to be, and said, "Tell me who gave you the keys, and tell them they better come get him back." Snoop stood frozen in the doorway, hands in his pockets, surveying the scene. He wasn't mad, yet. But something about the entire vibe of the studio felt wrong. It was supposed to be a sanctuary of creativity, the birthplace of hits, but right now, it looked more like a glorified influencer's den. There were ring lights scattered around, LED strips pulsing in neon hues, and kids in matching hoodies doing poorly executed TikTok dances. The sound of a mood music playlist filled the room, but it didn't even have a bass line. This was his studio. This was where legends had been made, where Dre, Game, Kendrick had all come through and laid down real tracks. But today, it felt like a cheap imitation. The space was filled with a group of young people, most of them glued to their phones, arguing over captions and hashtags like they were in some sort of competition to see who could look the most relevant. No one even noticed him at first. Snoop cleared his throat, the deep, gravelly sound slicing through the nonsense like a blade. The kids froze, eyes flicking to the man standing in the doorway, the real one, the one they'd only seen on their screens. "Yo, y'all making a movie or recording some music?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. A guy in a hoodie, too confident for his own good, finally spoke up. "We're just vibing, you know? Doing what we do. This is a content studio now, bro. We got all the gear for TikTok, the vibe's on point." Snoop tilted his head, staring at the kid like he was crazy, but then a slow smile spread across his face. Nah. This is my space. The studio. It used to have a little more rhythm. He stepped inside, his boots clicking on the floor with a steady beat. "And last time I checked, TikTok don't make legends." Snoop didn't need to say a word when he stepped further into the studio. His face alone said it all, because the way he scanned the room, slowly and without blinking, told everyone that he wasn't just confused by what he saw, he was calculating it, measuring the vibe against what he built from scratch, registering how the energy in the room had shifted from real to rehearsed, from raw creativity to overly filtered content, and when his eyes landed on a soft pink neon sign that said "Creator Energy Only," hanging right where a framed photo of him and Dre used to be, that was the moment his expression changed just slightly, still calm, still Snoop, but now there was a different kind of quiet beneath it. The kid in the hoodie with iced out chains and teeth too white to be natural walked up like he owned the place, like he wasn't standing in a temple of hip-hop culture that had birthed some of the most iconic sounds of the West Coast, and instead of introducing himself with even a shred of humility, he said, "You good, OG? This is kinda a shoot day, we're in the middle of some content," and the tone he used wasn't aggressive, but it was dismissive, like Snoop was the one out of place, like he was the one who had to explain why he was here. And Snoop just raised one eyebrow and smiled in that way that says, "You really don't know who you're talking to, do you?" Snoop walked farther into the studio with slow, heavy steps, each one echoing a little too loudly in a space that used to feel full of music and now felt full of air, and as he passed what used to be the vocal booth, where stories had been told, hooks had been sung, verses had been bled out from the heart, he caught a whiff of vanilla vape smoke and saw a ring light clamped to the mic stand, a girl posing with duck lips and auto-tune playing from someone's phone speaker, and he realized that this wasn't just about what had changed, it was about what had been forgotten. This space wasn't just walls and cables and equipment, it was history, it was the late nights, the failed takes, the jokes between verses, the quiet when something wasn't working and the explosion when something finally did, and now it had been hollowed out into a set, a background, a location tag on someone's Instagram story with a caption that read "Grind Mode Face with Steam from Nose Headphone," and the kid who posted that? He was doing push-ups on the floor for a dance challenge next to an unplugged guitar that hadn't been touched in weeks. Snoop turned around, slowly, calmly, and asked the kid, "So who gave you the keys?" Not loudly, not threateningly, just a question, but the weight of it dropped hard, because it wasn't really about the keys, it was about respect, it was about boundaries, it was about the kind of etiquette that no one teaches you in content houses, but that every real artist knows, and the silence that followed was louder than the music they'd been playing when he walked in. The kid shifted his feet, glanced at one of the others, then said something about a manager who said it was chill, and it wasn't even a full sentence, more like a shrug wrapped in words. And when Snoop narrowed his eyes just a little and said, "Name," the kid stumbled again, muttered something about a guy named Rico or maybe Rami, he wasn't sure, which told Snoop everything he needed to know. Because people who really get permission don't forget who gave it, and when you rent someone's name to boost your own, you better pray they don't walk through the door. The rest of the kids had stopped filming, stopped scrolling, stopped laughing, now they were just watching, phones in their hands, but no one recording, because even they knew that this wasn't a moment you captured, it was a moment you respected, and they could feel it, could feel the change in air, could feel how still the room had become, could feel the difference between content and consequence, and suddenly no one wanted to be the one who said the wrong thing. Snoop walked over to the wall where his old beat machine used to sit, now replaced by a pastel fridge filled with Celsius cans, and he tapped it twice with his finger before turning back to the group and saying, "You know what the first track made in this room was?" And no one answered, because they didn't know, because they hadn't cared to ask, and that was the difference. And when Snoop nodded and whispered, "Thought so," it hit harder than if he'd yelled. One of the girls, maybe realizing how bad it looked, tried to step forward with a soft, "We didn't mean disrespect, we just thought it was available," but Snoop cut her off with a gentle shake of his head, not in anger but in finality, and said, "Available and yours ain't the same thing," and just like that, the moment flipped, the authority in the room recentered, and now no one was confused about who was in control, not because he demanded it, but because he was it. Snoop took one last look around, let the silence stretch again, then simply said, "Call whoever gave you the keys. Tell them I want him back," and then he started walking back toward the front door, not storming, not rushing, just walking like a man who already knew how this would end, because he wasn't here to kick them out today. He was here to show them why they never belonged. After Snoop laid it out with that one sentence, "Call whoever gave you the keys," the room didn't just get quiet, it got still in a way that said nobody wanted to be the next person to breathe too loud, because even though his voice hadn't changed in tone, even though he hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown anything, hadn't flexed his name or his legend, the message had landed so deep that you could practically feel the room tilting, like all the energy that had once belonged to the kids was slowly sliding over to him, and the kids, those same influencers who had been arguing over trending sounds and transitions just 10 minutes ago, were now standing like interns who just realized they walked into the CEO's office thinking it was a coffee room. Snoop didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't take off his shades or sit down or act like he was waiting for an answer, and that made it even heavier, because sometimes the loudest kind of confrontation is the one that lets the other person fill the silence with their own fear, and in that moment, the kid who'd spoken first, the one who'd called it Content Day, was looking around the room like someone else might step up, like one of his crew might know what to say, but they didn't, because they were all still trying to process the shift from casual to serious, and in Snoop's stillness there was that unspoken rule being enforced: you can't borrow someone's house and forget who built it. Snoop knew what they were thinking, could practically hear the logic they had used to justify it. The space was empty, someone said it was available, it's just temporary, we're not hurting anything. But what they didn't understand, and what he was about to make sure they never forgot, is that space isn't just physical, it's cultural, it's personal. It's layered with energy and legacy and sweat that doesn't show up on TikTok, and when you casually erase that with ring lights and juice bars, you're not just being disrespectful, you're trying to override history with something disposable. As Snoop walked slowly toward the soundboard that hadn't been touched with care in weeks, he tapped one button to shut off the Bluetooth speaker, silencing the poppy loop that had been playing since he walked in. And the room somehow got even quieter, not just because the music was gone, but because the beat had been the only thing filling the space between Snoop and everyone else, and now with nothing but air left, Every breath felt loud, every glance felt exposed, and all eyes were on him, not because he demanded it, but because the moment demanded it. The kids in the room were used to real-time feedback, likes, comments, live chats, but right now they were on Snoop's clock, and his clock moved different, slow and deliberate and loaded with patience earned through years of watching people talk fast and move sloppy, and as he turned one dial on the mixer, like he was tuning into something more real than the moment deserved, the room started to feel less like a studio and more like a classroom, except this lesson wasn't on content strategy or camera angles. It was about what happens when you build fame on ground you didn't water yourself. Snoop pressed play on a track stored deep in the system, something raw, unreleased, bass-heavy, with his voice layered in between Dre's drums and Nate's harmonies, and the second it dropped, the walls seemed to shift. The floor seemed to remember what it was built for, and the kids didn't dance, didn't film, didn't throw their hands up. They just stood there, because they felt it, not the hype, not the trend, but the weight, the depth, the real. And when Snoop looked back at them over his shoulder, it was with the kind of look that didn't ask, "Do you get it now?" but more like, "Can you even begin to?" There was a kid in the back, hadn't said a word the whole time, smaller than the rest, probably just the cameraman or a quiet producer in the crew, and Snoop caught him looking, really looking, at the board, at the speakers, at the mic like he just realized he was in a place people prayed to record in, and that's when Snoop knew at least one of them felt the truth of where they were, because the others were still fidgeting, still unsure if they were supposed to speak or stay frozen. But that one kid? That kid was learning, absorbing, respecting, and maybe, just maybe, he was going to walk out of there changed. Snoop turned the music down, not off, just low enough to talk over, and then he said it, not loud, not angry, but slow and direct. "Let me tell y'all something. I built this place when none of y'all even had phones. I sat right in that booth and made records that put food on hundreds of people's tables. This room ain't just walls and paint, this is my legacy. And you walked in here thinking it was another location for your content schedule. That's not just a bad look, that's a whole misunderstanding of the game." No one interrupted, no one rolled their eyes, no one smiled awkwardly or pulled out their phone to fake a call. They just stood there and took it, and Snoop let the silence sit after his words like punctuation. Because if they were smart, they'd remember this moment for the rest of their lives, and if they weren't, well, then they'd be back on someone else's couch filming half-hearted dance videos while the real artists kept shaping the future. Snoop didn't ask them to leave, didn't shout, didn't throw them out, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't have to, and as he turned off the track, stood tall, and looked them dead in the eyes, he said one final thing. "This place has always been about energy. You either bring something to it, or you get taken out by it. Y'all figure out which one you doing." Then he walked past them, slow and cool, the room opening like a tide, because the truth is, the keys they had didn't unlock nothing real, and they knew it now. When Snoop stood in the center of the studio, surrounded by a group of kids who had come in thinking they were borrowing space, but instead had stumbled into a legacy they didn't understand, he didn't need to yell or wave his arms to shift the direction of the moment. He just looked around, soaking in every detail of what had become of his studio. From the ring lights and LED strips to the mismatched furniture and neglected soundboard, and with one slow breath, he leaned over, tapped the console. With a kind of familiarity that made everyone in the room lean forward, and quietly asked, "Y'all ever make something that lasts longer than 24 hours? No one responded, but they didn't have to, because the look on their faces said everything Snoop needed to know. They were used to creating in sprints, filming and editing in one take, pushing content into the world and moving on before the algorithm changed, but now they were in the presence of someone who had recorded tracks still being sampled 2 decades later. And the fact that he wasn't yelling made it worse, because there's something about a man who teaches through tone instead of volume that forces people to listen even harder, and Snoop knew it, so he simply walked toward the corner, pulled out a spare mic, connected it to the old rig, and said, "Let's see if y'all know how to feel something that ain't trending." He flipped through his archive like a chef choosing ingredients, scanning dozens of beats with his fingers hovering just above the controls until he landed on one that hadn't seen daylight in years. A soulful West Coast rhythm with thick drums, lazy synths, and that undeniable bounce that made your head nod before you even realized it, and when it filled the room, it was like the studio itself exhaled in relief, as if the walls were tired of pretending to be something they weren't, and the moment the bass hit, the TikTokers didn't dance. They stood still, listening, watching, feeling the way the beat wrapped around the space like smoke. Snoop grabbed the mic, not to perform, but to demonstrate, and with a steady rhythm, he dropped a verse that wasn't written down, wasn't rehearsed, just spilled straight from the gut, each line layered with decades of truth, calling out the fakeness of the moment while inviting realness in, rapping not for applause, but to remind the room what it meant to speak from somewhere deeper than likes and loops, and by the time he finished, no one said a word, not even the kids who had probably memorized every viral song on the internet, because they knew that what they just heard wasn't content, it was a reminder. He didn't point fingers, didn't call them clowns or disrespectful or shallow, but instead walked across the studio slowly, eyes never leaving the group, and said things like, anybody can copy a trend. But how many of y'all can make the world stop and listen? And you post 3 times a day and wonder why nobody remembers you the next week. And the way he said it, soft, low, but sharp, cut deeper than any insult. Because he wasn't mocking them, he was challenging them to rise, to understand that what they were chasing wasn't presence, it was noise, and in this space, noise wasn't enough. Then he did the thing no one expected. He invited them to sit down, to come closer, to touch the controls, to learn how real sessions are built, from EQ to layering, from mic placement to bounce. And for the next hour, Snoop walked them through the heartbeat of his process, not lecturing but storytelling, describing how certain drums were chosen not for volume but for memory, how verses were built with the audience's soul in mind, not their scroll time, and the longer he spoke, the more their shoulders relaxed, not because he had forgiven them, but because they were finally beginning to understand where they were standing. One of the younger kids, who'd barely spoken since the beginning, asked Snoop a quiet question, how do you know when a song's ready? And Snoop, without even pausing, replied, when it doesn't feel like it belongs to you anymore. And that answer didn't just land, it stuck, because for the first time, the room wasn't filled with creators trying to impress, but with young artists trying to understand, and the difference was everything, and Snoop could feel it, like the studio itself had shifted back into alignment. No one was filming now, no one was live streaming, no one was faking reactions for content. They were just sitting with notebooks out, heads down, taking in every bar, every breakdown, every story about missed deadlines and surprise hits, about failures that led to classics, about late nights that turned into legacy, and Snoop didn't even have to say it. He knew they were finally hearing the message, not because it was loud, but because it was earned. By the time they started testing their own lines, timid at first, stumbling over rhymes and laughing nervously, Snoop was already adjusting the levels, coaching without ego, pushing without pressure, showing them how to listen, not just perform, and the sound that came out of the speakers wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. And when one of them landed a line that actually hit, the room let out a little cheer, not forced, not exaggerated, just proud, and Snoop smiled, not wide, but proud too, because that was the first honest sound this room had heard in weeks. When the session wrapped, and everyone started gathering their things, there was no loud celebration, no selfies, no rush to post, just a quiet understanding among them that something important had just happened, something too personal to share online. And as they walked toward the exit, one of them asked, "Are we good to come back?" And Snoop paused, nodded once, and said, "If you come back ready to build, not just borrow, yeah." And just like that, the studio was still his. The door wasn't closed, but it wasn't wide open either, because respect is something you carry with you, not something you find in a comment section. As the last echoes of the beat faded into silence and the kids began quietly packing up their ring lights and backpacks, the energy in the studio didn't return to what it was before, because it couldn't, because something fundamental had changed, not just in the way the space was used, but in how it was understood. And even though Snoop hadn't asked anyone to leave, hadn't thrown a single insult, hadn't kicked down the door or demanded anything beyond attention, it was clear in the way they moved. Slower, more careful, that they now knew this wasn't a space to casually occupy, it was a space you had to earn. There were no phones out now, no one trying to go live or stage a fake "we just vibin' with Snoop" moment, because the energy wasn't performative anymore, it was reflective, And the group who just hours ago had filled the room with hashtags and scripted reactions were now exchanging real eye contact, real nods, real moments of pause, and Snoop watched it happen without interrupting, knowing that if they left right now, in this exact state, something from this room would go with them, not just the sound, but the weight behind it. Snoop had seen this kind of shift before, not loud, not dramatic, but real, the kind where people don't even realize they've changed until they catch themselves acting different the next day. Maybe turning their phone off before writing, maybe closing their eyes before they speak into a mic, maybe realizing that silence isn't always empty, it's full of possibility if you know how to listen. And as the crew lingered, clearly not in a rush to leave, clearly not wanting to be the first to say goodbye, Snoop knew they weren't trying to be polite, they just didn't want to break what they had stumbled into. There was no laughter in the room, but there was no shame either, just this calm, shared moment where everyone seemed to agree, without saying a word, that something valuable had just happened, that they had seen a side of the game they'd only ever pretended to understand, and even the ones who wouldn't admit it out loud were carrying something heavier than when they walked in, like respect or humility, or just that feeling of having witnessed something real and unfiltered in a world full of filters. One of the guys, the loudest one from earlier, the one who had called it Content Day, sat down near the speaker like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he could, and Snoop noticed it but didn't press. Because part of growing up in the game is learning when to speak and when to just hold the moment. And when the kid finally did say something, it wasn't for attention, it was quiet, almost private, and all he said was, "I didn't know it was like this," and that one sentence hit harder than any apology, because it wasn't just about the studio, it was about everything. There are lessons you can package into content, how to EQ vocals, how to write a hook, but there are others you can't, things like self-awareness, reverence, timing, presence, and that's what Snoop had given them, not in lectures, but in atmosphere, in tension, and carefully placed silence, and they felt it now. Understood that no trending sound or viral audio could fake the kind of gravity that comes from simply being around something timeless. Even after most of them had left, a couple stayed behind, lingering in corners, walking slow, touching things gently like they were now part of a museum instead of a workspace, and one of them quietly snapped a photo, not for Instagram, but just for himself, and Snoop saw it, nodded, and let it happen, because when someone takes a photo out of respect, not clout, that's something different, and that difference, no matter how small, is where real artistry begins. Snoop finally sat down, leaned back in his old chair, lit something slow, and let the silence roll over the room like a warm blanket, the kind that doesn't suffocate but steadies your breathing, and he thought back to the early days, to the nights when this studio was nothing but cables and drywall, when belief was louder than music, and now here he was, watching a new generation quietly, maybe awkwardly, stepping into something bigger than them, and not backing away. People always think legends live behind velvet ropes and glass walls, but real legacy is quieter than that. It hides in the corners of rooms like this one, in the way the light hits an old mic stand, in the hum of monitors still tuned from last week's mix. And what those kids had found tonight wasn't access, it was invitation, the kind that doesn't get emailed, doesn't go viral, just lands in your chest and stays there if you're listening closely enough. When the last of them finally walked out, and the door clicked shut behind them, Snoop stayed seated, staring at the board, not replaying what happened, not judging, just soaking in the aftervibe of a room that had remembered itself, and he knew without needing to say it that if even one of those kids walked out with their head a little lower but their heart a little fuller, then everything he did tonight was worth it, because some lessons don't go platinum, but they still change the whole game. Snoop came back early the next day, not to check on anything, not to micromanage, just to sit for a bit. The studio was quiet, no ring lights, no voices bouncing off the walls. Just him, the board, and a fresh coffee. He looked around and noticed something small but loud. The mic was cleaned and placed neatly back in its stand, a notepad with half a verse left behind on the corner of the desk, and the Bluetooth speaker unplugged. Respect was still in the room, even after they were gone. Later that week, 2 of the kids came back, no phones, no crew, just them. They didn't ask to film. They asked to watch. One brought a USB drive and said, "Can you tell me if this sounds like anything?" Snoop didn't answer right away. He just nodded toward the couch and said, "Play it. If it don't feel like nothing, we'll figure out why." That's how it starts. That's how something real begins. The studio never needed saving. It just needed someone to remind others how to listen. What those kids got wasn't a punishment or a warning, it was a masterclass in presence. And as the beat came back to life over the next few weeks, Snoop smiled to himself every now and then. He didn't need to go viral. He didn't need to post. The vibe came back. The lesson stuck. And the door was still open, but only for those who knew how to walk in right.